evening, everyone. My name is Jane Herring, and I am with the World Affairs Council of Orange County on the West Coast. We have a bi-coastal event this evening, along with our colleagues in Connecticut, and our speaker is coming at us from New York City. We'd like to send a shout out to the Council on Foreign Relations and also support WorldNow with Jim Falk. A reminder to please put any questions in the Q&A box, not the chat room. And it is my great honor to introduce Jim Falk, who has been the president of the World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth when I was there, and he now is the host of WorldNow with Jim Falk. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jane. It is such fun to see you now in your new position in Orange County. I remember it was just a few years ago when you were an intern, and that's just great. Lots of interns throughout the World Affairs Council system have gone on and worked at World Affairs Council, State Department, etc. And Max Boot, congratulations, another New York Times bestseller.
Thank you very much.
It must have been pretty exciting yesterday to walk outside your door and see the New York Times and the cover of your book featured on the cover of the New York Times Book Review.
I won't lie, it was pretty cool. Nice to see after a lot of effort to produce the book. Nice to see it getting some recognition in the world.
Well deserved. Number 10 on the bestseller list. I know after tonight's podcast, it'll even go up higher and faster.
Yeah. Counting on everybody on here to buy at least 10 copies each. So that's going to propel it into the stratosphere.
So a very quick introduction. I think most of you know that Max, since 2002, has been at the Council on Foreign Relations as the Jeane Kirkpatrick Senior Fellow for National Security. This is his sixth book. I think I've read 3 of them, so I got about 3 more to go. The Road Not Taken, Edward Lansdale and the American Tragedy in Vietnam, was a Pulitzer Prize finalist in biography. Invisible Armies, in Epic History of Guerrilla Warfare. We might talk a little bit about that tonight. And then The Corrosion of Conservatism, Why I Left the Right, which was written in 2018. You're a regular columnist in the Washington Post. Very interesting article you wrote just a few days ago about the situation in Israel and Gaza. And you were a campaign advisor for John McCain, Mitt Romney, and Marco Rubio. And I think our viewers would be interested to know that you immigrated from Moscow and California. So again, welcome. Great resume.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be on with you.
So I have to say that when the advanced reading copy came and I saw that it was 735 pages, I went, oh my God. But you know, as you've had such incredible
it's a good physical as well as a mental workout, as we were discussing.
Strong reviews, New Yorker, Washington Post, New York Times, and many more to come. And I think one thing that people have noticed is that you really did approach this in such a balanced way. But I did ask Google how many books have been written about Ronald Reagan. Not quite as many as Lincoln, 15,000, but 11,000 for Reagan. What got you to decide to write a book when 11,000 other people had already attempted it?
Well, nobody told me there were 11,000 other books, Jim. If I'd known that, I would have never done it. No, actually, I knew there were a lot of books. I didn't know there were 11,000, but I certainly knew there were a lot of books about Reagan. But what I felt was that when I started this project more than a decade ago, I felt like, although there have been a lot of these books that have been produced, there was not really a great biography out there. There was not a definitive treatment. And I felt like Reagan was a president who deserved that. I mean, he was somebody who was very consequential for the entire world and certainly for the United States. And, you know, consequential in my own life, just growing up in the 1980s, he kind of loomed over the political landscape. So I felt like he deserved, you know, a much more in-depth and balanced treatment than he had received to date. And that's what I set out to do, to produce a book that was neither hit job nor hagiography, but really presented both his strengths and his weaknesses, his successes as well as his failures. And so I was very gratified to see just recently that the New Yorker wrote that Reagan, His Life and Legend, aims to be the definitive biography, and it succeeds. So I felt like that was my mission accomplished moment.
And what I thought made the book so interesting and different from others is the fact that you were able to obtain interviews with so many people. How many people did you interview and over what period of time?
Roughly 100 people over the course of the last 10 plus years, and many of those interviews I did at the beginning of this project, so like around 2013, 2014, on the theory that unfortunately the people who really knew Reagan were not getting any younger, and I had to, talk to them while I still could. And in fact, quite a few of them sadly are no longer with us. Folks like George Shultz or Colin Powell or Bud McFarlane, or a number of others that I talked to have since passed away. So I was very lucky to be able to talk to them. And I feel like this book actually was written in a kind of a sweet spot where we had enough distance from the Reagan presidency to let partisan passions cool and to really see Reagan in historical hindsight and with some degree of objectivity. And of course, there were also a ton of documents that have opened up in the years since, which I was able to, many of which I was able to look at the Reagan Library in Simi Valley, California. So providing, a very much behind the scenes look at Reagan's life and presidency, very different from what was chronicled in many of the news accounts at the time. And yet at the same time that I was able to read these documents and to gain some historical perspective, I was also lucky enough to still be able to talk to many of the people who really knew him very well and served him in very senior positions. And so I know that in the future, there's going to be other historians who are going to be adding to the pile of books on Reagan, and they will certainly have access to more documents because more documents are being declassified all the time. And it's a very slow, laborious, painstaking process. But what they're not going to be able to do is they're not going to be able to talk to many of the key players in the administration, as I was luckily able to do.
You also interviewed two young people that had a very close relationship. Well, perhaps not so close, but that's the children. And before you respond to that, let me just remind people to put your questions in the Q&A box. And I like to include your questions as much as possible during our conversation. Tell us about the interviews you had with Patty Davis and Ron Reagan Jr.
Well, they were both extremely helpful. I spent quite a bit of time with both Patty and Ron, and they were really very forthcoming and spoke to me, very, very openly about their parents. And they, like all the Reagan children, they don't, they love their parents and they certainly loved Ronald Reagan, but they don't make any bones about some of the difficulties in their family. And, the word dysfunctional often came up as a description of their family. I mean, they're the first to acknowledge that the reality of their family is very different from, kind of the family values rhetoric and imagery that Ronald Reagan trafficked in. In fact, there was a lot of pain and heartbreak in the Reagan family. I would say Ron Reagan probably was the most easygoing and the one who was kind of his parents' favorite. So he had kind of less trauma than the others, but certainly Patty and also Maureen, who died years ago, and Michael, who I talked to briefly, they all experienced various levels of kind of pain and suffering as they described it in the family dynamics, and so that was not, as that wasn't like one of the main themes of the book, but it was certainly something you have to get into because I wanted to present Ronald Reagan not just as a politician, not just as an actor and all these other professional roles, but also to present something of his family life and with very, very complicated family life.
And I heard you say in a prior interview that actually the children talked with you more about the relationship than they had really with each other, and probably have learned more about it from reading your book.
Yeah, this was actually one of the bizarre things. That was one of the bizarre things about doing this book was, I would be sitting down and talking with Patty and Ron, and they would be asking me like how the other one was doing because they're not really in touch with one another. So I became kind of, for a little bit anyway, kind of a messenger or go-between. But I was very gratified to see the reaction to the book. And I had some trepidation when I sent the galley to Patty and Ron, because it's certainly not all sweetness and light. There's a lot of pain and there's a lot of dark, a lot of the downsides of their father's legacy as well in there. But I was really, I loved their reaction, which was basically, I think the only change either one of them asked for, Ron asked me to put in the name of their housekeeper, Ann Allman. I'd referred to her, but I hadn't named her. But he said that Ann was very important to him growing up, and he thought she should be named. So I was happy to do that. But otherwise, they didn't have any changes to suggest. In fact, they said that not only did they think it was a very good and balanced treatment, but they actually learned things about their father from reading my book. So that was a great feeling.
Given the timing of your book, you were unable to spend time with George H.W. Bush?
Yeah, I was not able to spend time with George H.W. Bush, not able to spend time with Nancy Reagan, not able to spend time with Mikhail Gorbachev. So that's, even starting more than a decade ago, by that point, a lot of these folks were not doing well physically and really were not talking to interviewers. And so I had to take what I could get. But I certainly, was not able to reach everybody that I would have loved to speak to.
Let me read a line from a poem that Reagan's mother, Nellie, wrote in 1927. Think lovely thoughts, ennobling the soul, keeping them from strife. The sunny side's the only side. Tell us about how his mother and his father really impacted his life.
Well, they obviously had a profound impact on his life. I mean, everybody's parents have a profound impact on their lives, and certainly no different in Ronald Reagan's case. His father, Jack, was this alcoholic shoe salesman with kind of the Irish American gift of blarney. He was a great raconteur, but he was also somebody who lost job after job and would often disappear on multi-day benders and come back. And there, little Dutch Reagan, as he was known, and his brother Moon could hear raging arguments through the thin walls of their house. And Nellie Reagan, their mother, was a very religious, almost saintly woman, but she was also, kind of a frustrated actress, and with a very optimistic view of the world, as you referred to, citing that poem of hers. And so she imbued Dutch with this kind of invincible optimism, that almost Pollyannish, that he always tended to see the good in everybody, and to look always with great optimism to the future. And also, she put him on the stage from a very early age. Both Dutch and Moon, from the time they were kids, had bit parts in these theatricals that their mother would put on in churches and in other places in small town Illinois. And so that was what kind of gave him his first taste of acting and his first taste of applause. And he came to like both of those. I mean, I think there's a couple of other inheritances from his parents that are worth mentioning, which is that because the family moved so much, Dutch Reagan really did not spend a lot of time in any one town, and so didn't really get close to the other kids, and kind of that began a lifelong pattern of not really being close to anybody, with the partial exception of Nancy Reagan. He kind of erected this mental wall around himself. And the other, inheritance from childhood was his aversion to personality conflict, which is kind of at odds with the fact that he was often, seeking conflict as a politician. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall, et cetera. But in his personal affairs, he had enough conflict from being exposed to the arguments between his parents, and so he shied away from conflict with his kids or with aides or with other people, and so sometimes drove Nancy to distraction by not confronting people who weren't doing a good job for him, or pretending they were doing a good job. And kind of an aversion to uncomfortable realities was one of his inheritances from childhood, because even though he had this very difficult childhood, he idealized everything and talked only about the positive, just as his mother told him to, and did not dwell on a lot of the negatives and what we would today call a very traumatic and difficult upbringing.
And if I recall correctly in the book, you've talked to several people who said they always felt like they were staff. And we remember that the Bushes never were invited to the private quarters.
Yeah, that's an example of how distant Reagan was. I mean, this is very much at odds with his image on TV, because of course on TV he came across as kind of this avuncular, genial everyman next door that you want to have a beer with. But in fact, he wasn't really eager to have a beer with anybody. He was, his idea of a great evening was to go home, eat dinner in front of the TV, watching, Gunsmoke or Bonanza or something, then read a little bit and go to bed. He wasn't really a social animal. As Stu Spencer, one of his longtime political consultant, told me, he would have made a pretty good hermit. And so, there was always that the people who were supposedly closest to him actually realized that they were actually very distant from him. And Jim Baker, his first White House chief of staff, said to me, we could never forget that we were all hired hands, and we could serve him loyally one day and then be gone the next, and he wouldn't even notice that we were gone. So, or that we were there in the first place. So, that's kind of the reality of the Reagan personality, which is a little bit at odds with the image that he projected so successfully on TV.
Another image that we sometimes have of Reagan is not being one who would necessarily be intellectual or even smart. And yet, when you go to the Reagan Library and you look at the handwritten notes on his speeches, going back to when he worked for GE and other, just in his early life, he didn't have a photographic memory, but he had an innate talent to remember a script. Can you elaborate on how his mind worked?
Yeah, I mean, he was a tremendous communicator, and during his presidency, people tend to put him down and say, "Oh, he was just a guy who was reading a teleprompter, reading a speech written by somebody else." And it's certainly true that, like most presidents, and all modern presidents, he did read speeches written by somebody else, because modern presidents never write their own speeches. I mean, they rewrite them sometimes, but don't generally write them. But certainly going back decades before entering the White House, he was a very prolific speech giver and never had a speechwriter. He was his own speechwriter. And in fact, again, to cite Stu Spencer, who was his longtime political consultant, Stu said to me, Reagan was not only the best speech giver I ever met, he was the best speech writer. And that was a talent that he really honed representing GE in the 1950s when he was the host of General Electric Theater. And he wasn't just on TV, he was also going around the country giving, stump speeches on behalf of the company. And that's when he really learned how to write speeches. And he would do it with these index cards, and he would write down arguments, anecdotes, statistics, whatever on these index cards. And he would shuffle these index cards before a speech to produce a fresh speech so it wouldn't be stale. And then he would judge the audience reaction, and he would see what worked and what didn't. And so, an index card that didn't work, he'd just toss that out. But an index card that was a hit with the audience, he'd keep that in his pile and use it over and over again. So he developed very finely honed speeches, and he was very good at putting together arguments and really getting to the core of the argument, which is actually very hard to do, because a lot of people, when they talk around a subject and say a lot of extraneous stuff, whereas Reagan was very good at getting right to the core of it. Yeah, I mean, his talent was primarily in oral communications. He was very good at writing for himself things that were designed to be heard rather than read. But I also found, I read pretty much all of his letters that survive, and he was actually also a very good letter writer. He was always knew exactly how to strike the right note in a very short space with whoever he was writing to, whether it was conveying sympathy or encouragement, or it was always like an undertone of good humor. He was really, it was a pleasure, frankly, to read his letters. He was a very good letter writer. And the funny thing is, all of that is very much at odds with the diary that he kept when he was president, which was a huge bore, very stiff, not very interesting, not very insightful. And his two memoirs, which were both ghostwritten, which were horrendous, didn't really convey the Reagan personality at all.
And he certainly would be shocked by the language that is used in today's speeches, since, as you point out, when he would use the word hell in the diary, it would be H blank blank.
Yeah, he would do that with damn and hell, which to us don't even qualify as curse words, but for him, he wouldn't even spell it out in his diary. So that's a reminder that he was really a product of a world which no longer exists, of the small town world of the American Midwest of the early 20th century. Later on, Disneyland kind of made an attraction out of this, Main Street USA, but Reagan lived on the actual Main Street USA, not the Disneyland ride, but the actual reality of the 19 teens and 20s. And he certainly carried on a lot of the mores and morals of that time and place, long after they had become defunct in modern America.
And when you talk about who he was, I mean, certainly small town USA and then Hollywood, but it was really Nancy Reagan, wasn't it, who brought in the money, the friendship with people who had so much money that helped him in his political life.
Yeah, Nancy Reagan was absolutely indispensable to Reagan's political rise. And that wasn't because she had any political ambitions or political views of her own. She really didn't. Her only ideology, her only interest was in helping Ronnie to achieve what he wanted. But she knew that her husband wanted to make an impact in politics. So she set about helping him do that. And she was incredibly important because she was a very different personality type. Whereas, Ronald Reagan was very trusting, Pollyannish, good-natured, saw the best in everybody. Nancy Reagan was a worrywart. She was jittery. distrustful. So you kind of assume people were out to get him unless proven otherwise. And so, she was described to me by Reagan aides as kind of the HR department of Ronald Reagan Inc., that she was the person who often hired and fired on his behalf and kind of did the dirty work that he didn't want to do. And that was an absolutely essential function, because every successful politician kind of needs an enforcer to deal with people who are undercutting them. And that was Nancy Reagan. And that was not Ronald Reagan. But as his aide said, she was the tough one, not him.
We have a question from David Schulman here in Santa Fe. Talk about the relationship that he had with Richard Nixon.
Well, that's interesting, because you can actually chart it back to the late 1940s, when Reagan was still a liberal Democrat in Hollywood, and Richard Nixon was first running for the Congress and the Senate. And from the letters of his that I read at the time, Reagan had nothing but contempt for Tricky Dick, as he became known, and thought that he was completely unprincipled and an opportunist, but then really changed his tune. By 1960, Reagan was on a first-name basis with Dick Nixon, and Reagan was the head of Democrats for Nixon. And the only reason he was still a Democrat was because Nixon asked him to remain a Democrat, because he thought it would be more powerful to have Reagan's endorsement as a Democrat than as a Republican. And then, Reagan developed this tremendous respect for Nixon, which was not reciprocated, because we can actually listen to the White House tapes and hear Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon denigrating Reagan and talking about how, Christ, he doesn't have an ounce of intellect, he doesn't know what the hell is going on, basically looking down on him as kind of a dunce. But they had great respect for his political skills and his political standing. And so they kind of catered to him. And when he was president, Richard Nixon sent Reagan around the world, basically as his envoy to right-wing dictators, and made sure that he, the care and feeding of Ronald Reagan was a major directive in the Nixon White House, because they didn't want Nixon to challenge him in the primaries, and he didn't. And then Reagan was actually kind of a diehard Nixon defender until the end. He didn't believe that Nixon did anything wrong during Watergate. He constantly defended Nixon, and even defended Spiro Agnew. And so Reagan was really shocked in 1974 when Nixon had to resign. He didn't expect that. What he was thinking was going to happen was that Nixon would serve out his term, leave office in 76, and then Reagan, as the former governor of California, would step in. He would become the Republican nominee. He would be Nixon's successor with Nixon's blessing. I think that's what he was counting on. So it was a very rude awakening for him when Jerry Ford all of a sudden becomes president in 74, blocking his own path to the White House. And that's what led to his audacious gambit in 1976 to challenge Ford for the Republican nomination, which a lot of Republicans were opposed to, because, this was a primary challenge to a sitting Republican president, which wound up undercutting Ford and hurting his chances of winning, the election. But Reagan had very little respect for Ford, did not have the same respect for Ford that he had for Nixon, thought that Ford was kind of an accidental president, a usurper, and so he took him on. But he always retained his respect for Nixon, and would, regularly, Nixon would come into the White House, talk to him, offer advice. And again, if you read Nixon's private letters, he thought that Reagan was kind of out of it, didn't really know what was going on, but he still offered his advice, and Reagan took it very respectfully. And Reagan didn't have an ounce of the kind of backbiting and second guessing and cynicism of Nixon. He was actually very idealistic in his dealings with Nixon.
So I want to go back to the speeches for a minute, because he often told, I wouldn't say lies, but falsehoods, misinformation, and it was very hard to get him to change. Where was he getting his information, and what should that tell us about how he operated, that he was so hard to get him to look at things in a different way?
Well, Reagan was a very voracious but somewhat indiscriminate reader, and he had a weakness for reading a lot of right-wing publications, and he would read Reader's Digest and Human Events and National Review and many other sources, which were often writing things that were not strictly speaking true, that were often kind of apocryphal or a little bit too good to be true. But Reagan would have a tendency to believe it, and then he would lodge in his memory banks, and he would keep repeating it in speech after speech, even after it was pointed out to him that what he was saying was not really accurate. He also, by the way, I found, read John Birch Society publications and picked up, faux facts from there. Often he had a weakness for quoting communist leaders describing their plot to take over America by passing, social welfare legislation like Medicare and Medicaid, and suggesting that the Democrats were being dupes of some Kremlin conspiracy. And he would cite these phony quotes from Soviet leaders, which they had not really said. They were just made up by the John Birch Society. But again, he wasn't doing this cynically. He wasn't trying to lie. He actually thought this was accurate. But I will say, I think he did have somewhat of a cavalier attitude towards, factuality, because I think Reagan's view was that what mattered was emotional truth. And if it was emotionally true, whether it was strictly speaking factually true was less important. And there was, for example, in my book, I cite one example where he said for years that no nation has ever survived giving 1/3 of its national income to the government, which wasn't even true in the 1960s, and definitely not true in later years, where every nation, every modern, Western democracy, including the US, the government takes more than 1/3 of GDP. But, there was a grad student who actually quizzed him on this in the 1960s and said, Governor, you keep saying this fact about it, nations don't survive 1/3 of their GDP to the government. What's the source for that? Where do you get that? Can you please give me a citation? And Reagan's reply was, oh, some economist said that. I read that years ago. I don't have that citation anymore. But he just kept on saying it, even though he couldn't actually back it up. So that he did have kind of a troubling, disregard of factual truth, even though he wasn't trying to lie. But he wasn't he didn't fact check what he was saying as carefully as he should have.
So Clint Hubbard asked a question which I think is very timely. He says, my belief is our troubles in the Middle East started after the Beirut bombing of the Marine barracks in 1983, and of course the embassy as well. And we've just showing weakness that continues to be exploited today. And, just a few days ago, Ibrahim Akil, the Hezbollah commander who was instrumental in that bombing of our Marine barracks, was killed in an Israeli airstrike in southern Lebanon. That really was an area where Reagan was often criticized for what happened in Lebanon on two counts. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, that was certainly one of the disasters of the Reagan administration, in part because Reagan didn't really know much about the Middle East. He only visited the region once, very briefly. He went to Iran in the 1970s. And so he didn't really know a lot about the Middle East. He was really focused on the Soviet Union and on communism, but he had to deal with the Middle East. And so he often got conflicting advice with his Secretary of State, George Shultz, and his Defense Secretary, Caspar Weinberger, kind of at each other's throats all the time. And, people who observed him in NSC meetings said he had a lot of trouble sorting out the advice, the conflicting advice, because he didn't really know what the right thing to do was. And so he got trapped into this ill-fated Marine peacekeeping mission in Lebanon in 1982, 1983, as a result of the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. And so these Marines were sitting at Beirut airport, kind of a sitting duck, and they were, their barracks was blown up by a precursor of Hezbollah, a suicide bomber in a truck full of explosives, killed 241 Americans. Horrible, horrible tragedy. And, Reagan didn't really know what to do about it. And Bud McFarlane, who was then the national security advisor, claimed that Reagan ordered U.S. aircraft from aircraft carriers to bomb Iranian barracks in Lebanon and what became known as Hezbollah, their positions. But the bombing never occurred. And Bud McFarlane always claimed that Caspar Weinberger, the defense secretary, blatantly disregarded a presidential directive, which Weinberger denied. And so I looked into this pretty closely and, went to the Reagan Library and asked if there was an order to actually bomb these barracks. And as far as I could determine, no such order was ever issued. I think what really happened was that when Reagan was talking to George Shultz and Bud McFarlane, who really wanted to bomb the barracks in retaliation for the bombing of the U.S. Marine barracks, Reagan kind of gave them the impression that he agreed with them. And then when he talked to Cap Weinberger, who didn't want to do the bombing, he kind of gave Weinberger the impression he agreed with Weinberger. And so he never really, he was kind of caught in the middle of this conflicting advice, and so never decided to do anything, and instead pulled all the remaining U.S. Marines out of Lebanon in 1984. And Bud McFarlane himself later said to me that he thought this encouraged Islamist terrorism, encouraged people like Osama bin Laden to think that with a few attacks they could drive the United States out of the Middle East. So it was a big mess, and that was certainly one of his foreign policy failures.
Before we talk about foreign policy success, tell us about Iran-Contra, because you devoted a lot of time of the book to that.
Well, this was another outgrowth of the failed Reagan policy in the Middle East. The Iran-Contra affair, of course, was the worst scandal of the Reagan administration, and it really grew out of the fact that Ronald Reagan was kind of a soft touch. Even though he was often remote from people around him, his heart really bled for the U.S. hostages who were seized in Beirut by Iranian proxies. He really, really wanted to get them out, and so his aides, led by Bud McFarlane, hatched this plot to sell weapons to Iran in return for the release of the hostages. And this was a fiasco from the get-go, because the Iranians did release a few hostages, but then they seized some more because they understood, the going price of hostages was pretty high. And then John Poindexter, who was the McFarlane's successor as national security advisor, and his aide, Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, concocted an even more audacious scheme to take the profits from the Iran-Contra affair and funnel them to the Nicaraguan Contras, even though Congress had said that the federal government could not support the Contras through the Boland Amendment. And so this was a potentially impeachable offense when it was uncovered in late 1986. But kind of the irony of Iran-Contra is that Reagan got into it because of his inattention to detail and his lack of hands-on management, but that also became his best alibi for getting out of it, because he said, I didn't know about the diversion of funds to the Contras. And, if Richard Nixon had said, I didn't know about something, nobody would believe him, right? Because Nixon knew everything that was going on. But when Reagan said, I didn't know about it, it was actually pretty credible. And so that was kind of his salvation. He avoided impeachment in part because he didn't know what was going on. But of course, he shouldn't have gotten into this mess in the first place.
So it won't surprise you, because I know that you're often asked this question. And Mark Morris asks, what about his cognitive decline? Did he have Alzheimer's while he was in office?
Well, again, I looked at this question pretty closely, including talking to Dr. Ron Peterson, one of his neurologists who treated him for Alzheimer's. And the answer is kind of complex, because what Dr. Peterson told me is that, people who develop Alzheimer's often have the plaques and whorls, the underlying conditions of Alzheimer's, years before they get dementia. And so the likelihood is that Reagan did have the underlying condition while he was in office, but I didn't really see any evidence that he had dementia. I asked this question of a lot of his aides and looked at his handwriting and his diaries, which remained pretty clear and firm throughout. So my conclusion was he didn't suffer from dementia in office, but he was certainly slowing down. I mean, remember, by the time he left office, he was almost 78 years old. He was not a young man. He'd been shot in 1981. So clearly he was always pretty aloof and hands off, but even more so towards the end of his presidency than the beginning of it. And often the people who were really his senior aides near the end, Frank Carlucci, Colin Powell, George Shultz, Howard Baker, they were often kind of making decisions among themselves and saying, let's figure this out. Let's not take this to the old man. Let's just make the decision. And they would only take it to Reagan if they had a disagreement. So he was definitely, slowing down just as a result of the natural aging process as his presidency went on.
So we have a question from John Lawrence, who, let me give a shout out to John. He lives in Santa Fe in Washington and was Nancy Pelosi's chief of staff and worked on the Hill for some 40 years and has a book now out. Well, it was in hardback. Now it's in paperback. Arc of Power, not Art of Power, but Arc of Power. And John says, Reagan, like Donald Trump, changed his political philosophy and party affiliation as he aged. Would Reagan be comfortable with Trump's Republican Party? And if not, would he speak no evil of another Republican or speak out like Dick Cheney about the extremist drift of the Republican Party?
I mean, hard to say, obviously, what Reagan would do if he were still alive. I sort of doubt that he would be denouncing the Republican Party, because he always believed in what he called the 11th commandment, thou shalt not speak ill of a fellow Republican. And so that's why, Dick Cheney's an exception, but there are a lot of senior Republicans like George W. Bush and others who are not speaking out. But I'm sure that Reagan would have been, like many of them, would have been denounced by today's Republicans as a rhino, a Republican in name only, because his brand of republicanism was so far removed from what we see today. I mean, remember that Reagan was somebody who was pro-free trade, pro-immigration. I mean, he actually signed a bill in 1986 that legalized millions of undocumented immigrants. He was pro-alliance, pro-NATO, pro-standing up to Russian aggression. And fundamentally, he just had this very positive, sunny vision of America as this shining city on a hill that was very far removed from what you hear today. He would certainly never refer to America as a failing country as Donald Trump does.
We have a question from an anonymous attendee. How did other world leaders view Reagan and his policies at the time? That's a broad question, but I'd like you to perhaps focus on it from the perspective of how they viewed his relationship with Gorbachev.
Well, I'll take it a little bit more broadly, actually,
Okay.
because Reagan elicited a lot of eye rolls at international summits because he was just not as on top of issues as a lot of other world leaders were. And as you know, he was closest to Margaret Thatcher, the British Prime Minister, and Brian Mulroney, the Canadian Prime Minister. But Thatcher was, you know, a very different type. She was a former barrister and, of course, had been in the Commons for decades. And so she was really on top of her brief. And at international summits, she would often argue Reagan's case or the US case more eloquently than Reagan himself could. But so she was, you know, a much better debater, whereas Reagan was actually a much better communicator and speaking to the entire world. But and sometimes, you know, when Reagan was going on with his anecdotes about Hollywood and his stock stories and so forth, you know, other world leaders would be kind of rolling their eyes and like whispering to each other, you know, what is he talking about? I don't get it. But I think one of the secrets of his success was he was a little bit oblivious to the condescension with which he was often treated by, even by his own aides, certainly by fellow world leaders. It didn't really matter to him. This was actually a great strength because I think one of the problems with people like Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, Donald Trump, they're really driven by resentment. They have this tremendous inferiority complex and they can't stand to be mocked or to have people like belittle them. They have kind of this attitude of like, oh, I'll show them, I'm going to get my revenge. And that's a very scary thing when you're the president of the United States. That was never Ronald Reagan. He never wanted to get revenge on anybody. He wasn't even, you know, aware of these slights, which were fairly, you know, which were just, it was like water off a duck's back. He didn't really care. And I think that was actually, you know, it could be a source of frustration for others, but I think ultimately it was a source of great strength for him that he didn't really care that much what people thought of him. He kind of had this self-confidence, which he had been imbued with ever since his childhood from his mother, really.
And he had Nancy Reagan guarding him.
Yes, absolutely.
So when you're talking about relationships, I think this is somewhat of a myth, but Scotty Herman from Dallas asks in comments, President Reagan and Tip O'Neill had many differences in their approach about how to govern, but they managed to work out their differences, sometimes over a glass or two of an adult beverage. One, is that really the case? And do you see a pathway today to return to the ability to compromise?
Well, it's a little bit of a myth that Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan were pals. They certainly were not. And in fact, Tip O'Neill could be very rough on Reagan, who he said was, you know, the worst president that he had ever dealt with, and somebody who didn't care about the poor. And I mean, O'Neill could be very scathing in his rhetoric. Reagan was not so scathing in his rhetoric, but they clearly had a lot of tension. But I think what ultimately made them a successful duo was that they were both, you know, very practical politicians. They also, of course, had, you know, they kind of played up their shared Irish American ancestry and their love of Blarney and so forth. But what really made them successful was that they were very practical politicians who knew how to count votes and understood what it took to get things done. And they were not ideologues, they were not extremists, they were not absolutists. So they knew how to cut deals. And so, you know, for example, in 1981, when Reagan proposed his Reaganomics budget, which included, you know, cuts in spending for the poor and massive tax decreases, Tip O'Neill didn't like that, but he understood that Reagan had the support of the majority of the country and the majority of Congress, even though Democrats controlled the House. And so he wasn't going to throw himself on the tracks to prevent Reagan from getting his way, because he basically calculated, you know, I'll let Reagan pass his agenda. And then if the economy turns south, he'll get the blame for it, which sort of happened. The Republicans had major losses in the 82 election because of a severe recession. Then, of course, things turned around and Reagan won re-election in 84 after, the economy came roaring back. But O'Neill and Reagan didn't have to like each other to deal with each other. And that was, I think, what made their relationship successful.
How did the assassination attempt change both Nancy Reagan, and his popularity?
It was obviously a very traumatic event, and Reagan came much closer to dying than his aides admitted. But I think,
and we should remind people it happened in March of his first year in office.
Yeah, right. Just shortly after he was inaugurated, he was shot and almost died. But the courage and resilience that he showed in this horrible moment really resonated to his benefit. I mean, he was, about to be operated on in the hospital at George GW Hospital, and he was joking with the doctors, saying, "I hope you're all Republicans." Or he told Nancy, "Honey, I forgot to duck." And when people read that, they not only thought he was going to get well, but they thought much better than they had in the past, and that certainly boosted his popularity, because that was, I mean, I call the chapter on the shooting "Finest Hour," because that really was his finest hour, and it really resonated with the American public. And when he came back, and back to the White House and back to his job, he had a massive boost in popularity, which propelled his first-term budget over the finish line in Congress. One of the takeaways that Reagan had from the shooting, by the way, was that he thought that he had been spared by the Almighty for a higher purpose, which was to avert nuclear Armageddon. And so it made him much more interested in negotiating with the Soviets and trying to reduce the risk of nuclear war. And of course, the final consequence, which needs to be mentioned, is that it made Nancy Reagan even more worried than before, and led her to hire an astrologer, Joan Quigley of San Francisco, to do Reagan's, to read his stars all the time. And this astrologer actually became pretty influential in scheduling the president's movements and travel and so forth. So that was kind of Nancy's reaction to this trauma. And in many ways, she was, more psychologically traumatized than her husband, who'd actually been shot.
Did he know that she was that she was modifying his calendar?
Yeah, he knew, but I think, and
That's just Nancy.
I'm not sure to what extent he believed in astrology, but I think his attitude was probably that he was better off humoring her.
We have several questions asking about the collapse of the Soviet Union and the role that he played. And you really, in your book, outlined this so well. Maybe you could hit some of the top points right now.
Well, one of the legends about Ronald Reagan is that his tough actions against the Soviet Union his first term brought down the evil empire. The fact that he called it the evil empire and boosted defense spending, launched SDI, the Missile Defense Initiative, gave aid to the Afghan freedom fighters and so forth. So that there's this legend that this is what brought about the collapse of the Soviet Union. In fact, all it really achieved was creating a series of war scares in 1983 that scared even Ronald Reagan and made him, want to reach out to Soviet leaders. But he didn't really have anybody to reach out to, because as he kept complaining, they kept dying on him. And it wasn't really until 1985 that Reagan's approach towards the Soviet Union began to pay off, when Mikhail Gorbachev became the leader of the Soviet Union. Gorbachev was really a black swan, somebody who rose to the top of this dictatorial system and lost faith in it and wanted to reform it. And he wasn't driven to do that because the Soviet Union was going bankrupt. It wasn't. He wasn't driven to do that because he wanted to keep up with Reagan's defense buildup. He didn't. He wanted to end the arms race, and he wanted to spend money on the citizens of the Soviet Union rather than on their defense industry. And so, he launched these very radical reforms, which ultimately brought down the Soviet Union. And that was not Ronald Reagan's doing. But I think what he does deserve credit for is recognizing that Gorbachev was a very different kind of Soviet leader, somebody he could actually work with, even though a lot of conservatives, including his own defense secretary, Caspar Weinberger, were very suspicious of Gorbachev. But Reagan met him in Geneva in 85 and came away very impressed. And so I think, he was willing to put aside a lifetime of anti-communist dogma to work with the world's leading communists to reduce Cold War tensions and reduce nuclear stockpiles. So I think he deserves tremendous credit for that, and did play a role in peacefully ending the Cold War. It just wasn't the role that a lot of his admirers ascribed to him.
And he really had a backbone because I wasn't aware of the sharp internal division that was going on within the national security establishment.
Yeah, and that was really based on his own personal read of Gorbachev and meeting with him. And it's fascinating to read the transcripts of their exchanges in Geneva and Reykjavik and their other meetings. I mean, at Geneva, for example, Reagan made a big impression on Gorbachev during a dinner toast by talking about how even though there was a Cold War on, imagine what would happen if the world was being threatened by aliens and the Soviet Union and the US would unite in defense of the world against these aliens. And he was basically suggesting that nuclear weapons were these aliens that threatened the world. And so these kinds of human exchanges really uh, humanized Reagan to Gorbachev and vice versa, and made it possible for them to work together.
We know formulating foreign policy in the United States is not easy. It's complicated, lots of different actors. And you really saw that in the speech that he gave, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall. Could you give us just sort of a flavor of how he again showed his backbone and said, I'm going to give this speech?
Well, that was of course a landmark speech, which was primarily written by one of the White House speechwriters, Peter Robinson. There was a lot of dissension within the State Department and elsewhere, suggesting that the rhetoric of Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall, was too confrontational. And Reagan, at this point, truthfully, this was 87. Reagan was not that involved in drafting speeches anymore, but you know, he ruled on that phrase and gave it a sign off, and it was included. But you know, I will say, based on my own research, I don't think that this was a central event in the end of the Cold War, because Gorbachev didn't really need Reagan to tell him to tear down the Berlin Wall. He had already basically determined that he was not going to use force to keep the Soviet Empire together. And so when, you know, a couple of years later, German citizens began tearing down the Berlin Wall, Gorbachev did not turn this into a German version of Tiananmen Square. He did not send out the tanks. But that, again, that wasn't because Reagan told him to do that. It was because of his own humane instincts.
Did they have a lot of, Reagan and Gorbachev, did they have a lot of private communication letters?
Yeah, there were certainly letters going back and forth, but I mean, private is, you know, is should be used in air quotes, because I mean, private communications were still read by, you know, dozens of officials, and there were lots of people involved in drafting their so-called private communications.
So moving to domestic issues, Hillary Willett asked, regarding domestic economic events under President Reagan, did trickle-down economics start with him?
Well, that was certainly the nickname given to Reagan, Reagan's supply side economics by his detractors, because, you know, the Reagan theory was that if you gave big tax cuts to the upper 1%, then they would, you know, start companies, create jobs, and stimulate the economy. And, you know, the record of that theory uh, is very uneven, because there was, you know, some economic stimulus in the 80s, and the economy did come roaring back from this very deep recession. Although I think that Paul Volcker and the Fed actually deserve primary credit for that, for wringing the inflation out of the economy. But you know, if you look at charts of income inequality in America, they really began to diverge very radically in the early 1980s, and we became a much less equal society beginning in the early 80s, with the top, you know, or top income earners making vast amounts of money, and the rest of society either stagnating or going backwards. And that wasn't something that Reagan worried about, but I think it is something that has become a problem, because it's that income inequality has really led to the rise of populism on both the left and the right. You know, Occupy Wall Street, the Tea Party, now Trump, and it's really led to loss of faith in the American system and the American government. It has really serious political consequences, which you can trace back to the early 1980s.
Sketch out for us what you think might happen in the election if President Trump wins, loses by a little bit, or loses significantly. You just recently wrote an article that appeared in The Atlantic on September 8th, how the GOP went from Reagan to Trump.
Yeah, and I mean, as I suggested, I think the difference is between Trump and Reagan are greater than the similarities, but there are still some continuities, including the fact that Reagan, trafficked in a kind of populism, and, he denigrated the federal government and lessened, faith in the federal government. He would always joke that, the worst words in the English language are, "I'm here from the federal government, I'm here to help you." And he would, denigrate the government even when he was running it. And that's certainly something that Trump does, even more vociferously. I mean, my general thesis is that, Republican politics has been really drifting to the right pretty steadily since Barry Goldwater in 1964, and each generation of Republicans is further to the right than the previous one. And so Reagan was to the right of Nixon and Ford, and Trump is well to the right of Reagan. And I'm sure, Reagan would be shocked by where the Republican Party has wound up, but you can kind of see how inadvertently he played a role in getting the Republican Party here. I mean, I think the ultimate irony here is that in 1981, when Reagan became president, his ascension was widely and correctly, I think, seen as moving the Republican Party and the country to the right. Whereas today, if the Republican Party embraced Reaganism, it would actually be moving to the left. It would be returning to the center. And is that going to happen? I just don't know. I mean, I think anything is possible if Trump loses, because I don't see a natural successor in place. I think there will certainly be a battle for the soul of the Republican Party, but and I
Do you
think
see an opening, Max, for a third party?
it's very hard to have a third party in the U.S. just because of the way our political system is kind of rigged in favor of two major parties. I mean, remember, the last successful third party in the U.S. was the Republican Party in the 1850s, so it's been a while.
One of the things that surprised me was that in Reagan's early childhood, he certainly was, from his parents, is open-minded, certainly not any bone of racism. And yet he voted against the Civil Rights Act. He certainly looked as hard as he could to get votes from the South. Explain just sort of how he was able to rationalize that.
Well, Reagan often said, "There is not a trace of bigotry in my nature. There is no bigotry in my heart," and often cited the story of how his father, Jack Reagan, would not let the family see Birth of a Nation, this, horrible racist movie that glorified the Ku Klux Klan. And certainly Reagan's kids told me that he certainly brought them up without any bigotry, and told them to avoid prejudice and so forth. But there is no doubt that he took advantage of the white backlash against civil rights throughout his political career and opposed civil rights legislation. And, he kind of convinced himself that civil rights laws were an infringement on private property rights. And as he said, they were a bigger evil than the supposed evil that they were trying to correct, which is, so absurd on so many levels when you think about the evils of Jim Crow and lynching and the terrible violence and discrimination that African Americans have suffered for hundreds of years in the U.S. And he was somewhat oblivious to that, and kind of trafficked to this white backlash using kind of ostensibly neutral but kind of loaded language about law and order, and didn't want our streets to become jungle paths after dark, talking about welfare queens and states' rights. So that was, integral in moving the South out of the Democratic Party into the GOP, but it also completely alienated Republicans from the African American community.
And when you think about his close association in Hollywood and knowing so many actors, he really turned his back on the LGBTQ community.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, he was of an age, I mean, he was born in 1911 in small town Illinois. So, homophobic attitudes were obviously, kind of par for the course when he was growing up. And I would say he was probably less homophobic than a lot of other, straight guys of his generation. I mean, in 1978, he opposed an initiative in California that would have prevented gay people from being teachers in the public schools. Crazy, crazy legislation. But he was certainly, oblivious to the toll of AIDS, didn't speak about it until 1987, even as tens of thousands of Americans were dying. He even said things like, he thought that AIDS might be God's punishment towards homosexuality, stuff that, I mean, the amazing thing is Democrats hardly ever attacked him for his record on AIDS in the 1980s, but in hindsight, it looks terrible. I mean, it's like, you have to wonder, like, what was he thinking? And certainly
Was Nancy responsible for
friends.
changing his views on this?
Well, Nancy tried to change his views because she got a lot of gay friends, but And I think he started to get it after he left the presidency, but certainly his record on AIDS while he was in office was very poor.
Michael Schwartz says, what do you think is the most accurate image of Reagan, the legend, that is, as he's remembered, and what is the most important misconception?
Well, there's so many, I mean, there's so many misconceptions. I think we've talked a lot about those misconceptions during the last hour, including this misconception that he bankrupted the Soviet Union, this kind of misconception that he was this very warm, amiable, genial, friendly guy when he was actually somewhat remote and didn't really have a lot of close friends. I mean, there was also the misconception that he often propagated, saying, I didn't desert my party deserted me, to suggest that he hadn't changed his views. It was the Democratic Party that had changed, whereas in fact, he actually did change his views and moved from the left in the 1930s to become very right-wing by the 1960s. So I mean, we could go on and spend another hour talking about the legends
Well,
about
one
Ronald
is
Reagan.
that he was much more governed much more pragmatically. You highlight that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the reality of Reagan, was that he could be very ideological as a campaigner, but as governor and president, he could be very pragmatic and compromise, as we talked about with Tip O'Neill or others, and really get things done. And I think that was really the secret of his success, the ability to moderate once in office, move to the center and cut deals. And I think that's why he's ranked by historians as a top 10 president, which is for all his failures and setbacks, that's a monumental and well-earned achievement.
This is an interesting question from Mark Held in Pittsburgh. Did President Reagan ever express any regrets about his time in office, things done or undone?
Almost none. He was not very self-reflective. The only regret he really expressed was that he didn't balance the budget. And he had talked for decades about how terrible budget deficits were. And of course, under him, the budget deficit increased tremendously. So that was the only regret that he ever expressed. But he hated to look back. He always looked forward. He didn't second guess himself. And so he was very frustrating as an interview subject for historians and journalists, because he would just not reflect with any degree of objectivity on what he had done.
Unfortunately, we're running out of time. Are there any last comments you'd like to make? Max, I'll give you another 30 seconds.
Well, I mean,
Other
thanks
than
for the
everyone buy the book.
conversation. Yeah, buy the book. I've been very gratified by the reception of the book. New York Times bestseller, described as the definitive biography by the New Yorker, magisterial by the Washington Post, and a gripping read by the New York Times. So, you know, I've been very gratified by the feedback. I love this conversation, Jim. I love to delve into the paradoxes and mysteries of Reagan's life, and I tried to, you know, very hard to set those out as objectively and as balanced a fashion as possible. So
Well, I
thanks for
think
giving
you
me a
certainly
chance to talk
succeeded.
about
Someone
that.
asked me a day ago whether or not you approached that as a Republican or as a Democrat, and I said just straight down the middle, and everyone should read the book. Thanks again for being with us, Max Boot. And let me mention that very soon we'll be talking to James Wilson, who is a State Department historian, about his book, Focus of America's Cold Warrior, focusing on Paul Nitze. And really interesting. I'm about halfway through the book where he talks about disarmament and deterrence. So I think you'll enjoy that on October 23rd. Also pleased that early in the next year, we'll have a talk with General McMaster. And you can catch the end of Ambition, our interview with Stephen Cook, on Apple or wherever you listen to your podcast. Again, thanks for being here with WorldNow, Jim Falk, produced by the World Affairs Council of Connecticut with support from all these partners. Have a great evening. See you next time.
Thanks for having me.